Alright, so since we're kind of heading into the releases of, like, the summer movies, and we have Doctor Strange next week, obviously, this was a pretty uneventful weekend with these two coming out. One of them being a theatrical release, and the other being on HBO Max, which I'm not entirely sure if The Survivor has any kind of theatrical release or not. I have no idea. It's HBO Films, which is usually associated with their like their TV movies from back in the day and stuff like that. And well, their TV movies from today also, but that's let's go into these and let's start with the theatrical release, which is Memory, another Liam Neeson movie that's not as much of an action movie, I guess, as many of his others, or how you typically visualize a Liam Neeson action movie that usually are like revenge driven and stuff like that. Because it is based on or it's a remake of the movie from Belgium, The Memory of a Killer, which is also called The Alzheimer Case, I think. Neither of which are really great titles. And I think it came out in Belgium in 2003, and then it finally came over here around 2005. And it is a pretty close remake. So it is something that might seem a bit more, not necessarily downplayed, but just in general not as action heavy as you might be expecting from a general Liam Neeson movie nowadays. But the thing that was kind of pushing me towards this also was because you don't typically go into there are remakes of foreign movies that can be good and sometimes even surpass their original. But I mean, when we're in this area of the quality of Liam Neeson's action movies kind of getting lower and lower, you kind of go into this with certain expectations. Like, I'm going to doubt this is going to be one of those kind of remakes. That's ultimately shows that, oh, this was worth doing at the end of it. And it's, like, not only that, but it's, like, close enough to the original also that also kind of makes it feel a bit unnecessary. But another thing that was driving me towards this was the fact that Martin Campbell directed it. And the thing about Martin Campbell is I just keep coming back to him. I keep regretting it, but I still keep coming back to him because, he's relaunched Bond twice successfully, because he did GoldenEye and he did Casino Royale. And, he did, The Mask of Zorro and stuff like that. I think the last movie he did that I actually liked was probably The Foreigner, the one with Jackie Chan and Pierce Brosnan. But because of those movies, every time he makes a movie, I always have just a little bit of hope. And the problem with that is he also did, Green Lantern and stuff like that. He did the Zorro sequel and stuff. He's got a lot of shit. He did The Protege. I think that was just last year, if not the year before. And The Protege was the same way. I went into it and it's like, is this going to be... Because you're never quite sure when Martin Campbell was going to hit it out of the park. Even though he, more often than not, doesn't. I always have that hope in me, like one of these, it's one of those cases where I maybe could have skipped this weekend, but it's like, if Martin Campbell's going to come back and make another really good movie, I don't want to miss it. Like, I don't want to miss that happen. When I went into this, it had a Rotten Tomatoes score of like 29% or something. But you never know how you're going to actually feel, so I went ahead and went anyway, just like kind of hoping there was going to be something in there. And it's not a terrible movie. It's certainly not 29% on Rotten Tomatoes bad. The idea that might give you, it's not that bad. And I think probably the best thing it could have done was stay as close to the original as it does. Even if that does ultimately make it more unnecessary in the long run. But as far as this being another Liam Neeson movie, because he's made some of his, movies in this vein, this, post-Taken career that he's had, some of them have been pretty dark and pretty brutal. Walk Among the Tombstones comes to mind, at least as one. They kind of blend together there. Cold Pursuit was pretty good, too, and it was also a remake of a foreign movie, go figure. But going into this, you do expect him to be, like, either the hero or the anti-hero or stuff like that. And I suppose you could call this guy an anti-hero, but he's a pretty bad guy. Like that's the first thing that kind of intrigues me about this being part of this Liam Neeson action movie, like subgenre, I guess you could call it. Is typically he's like a straightforward good guy. And this guy's probably 85 to 90% bad guy. Like he's got like a quality. He's got one rule about himself because he's a hitman, and he has one rule to where it's like, okay, I'm on board with him on that at least, and that's what ends up driving the plot and what this story is. Which the story itself is much darker. It has much darker subject matter than a typical Liam Neeson action movie or what you might be expecting out of one. Because, like I was talking about it being a very close remake, when I came into it, despite the fact, that it is an R-rated movie, but still, I went into it thinking, like, this is the Americanized version of that other movie. It's probably going to be watered down, and not really. In some cases, it actually goes even farther than the original movie, as far as, like, its cold-bloodedness. Like this opening scene, for instance, where we're introduced to his character, and they want to show how ruthless he is. And you're like, oh, well, it's an action movie with Liam Neeson, he's eventually going to be a decent guy at the end, even if he's still a hitman and all that. And the opening kill is him strangling a guy to death, Anton Chigurh style, with the blood shooting out as he strangles him, in front of his hospital bed-laden mother. And who has to just lay there and watch this silently because she can't communicate. And it's like, for that to be the opening scene and that to be the introduction of this character, that's pretty cold-blooded. So that right away was pretty interesting. And I don't think that's a scene in the original movie. I think we just jump right into what is essentially the second scene in this movie, was the opening scene of the last one, the original. But, so, yeah, in that sense, I was confident that this wasn't going to be a watered-down version, and it's not. So it does have that going for it, as far as being a remake. And then we're introduced to our other set of characters, who are all the cops. And there's a lot more cops in this one. And the cop that we're following as kind of our main sort of, I guess, secondary protagonist, would be Guy Pearce. And that's obviously Liam Neeson's character is falling further and further into Alzheimer's. So, and he's like in the early stages of it, and he's trying to deal with that while also doing his job. And then as his job goes awry and people start to come after him, and the people he works for, they start to fight each other, is what our essential story is. And Guy Pearce being in a movie about memory loss, it kind of just feels like casting for the sake of an in-joke. There's even moments where, like, much like Leonard Shelby, Neeson's writing stuff, on his body, or on his arm anyway, to, like, little notes that remind him of what he's doing. But, so, as far as it almost feeling like Guy Pearce is just, like, ha-ha casting here, it is interesting because immediately you just kind of think, especially with Guy Pearce being put in, like, the cop role of this, you think, oh, great, we're going to watch Guy Pearce's talent get wasted yet again. But it's a character that's very driven, and he has some pretty dramatic moments, but at the same time it still feels like he's not brought completely to his talent. So, but it's more so than, like, the normal throwaway sort of cop role is, I guess. When you are looking at the original and then looking at this one, the cops do have a lot less personality. Like, that was one of those cases where you saw a lot of stuff in the original movie where the cops were those kind of characters that had conversations that weren't exposition and weren't related to the plot. They were just kind of being characters and kind of dwelling on that a little bit, which is good. But these aren't really like... The closest we get to, like, a character trait from some of the secondary cops are one of them is trying to learn Spanish. That's pretty much it. And there's one that goes in another direction that kind of takes it a bit of a step further than the original went. But it comes in really, really late in the game. So for the most part, it just feels like very generic cop characters for a very long time. And even if there is a specifically significant payoff for one of them, still there's a lot of blandness until we get to that, which is most of the movie. So, and this also isn't helped by there's a lot of really stiff dialogue, especially in the first part of it, where you can tell it's dialogue that's like meant to be kind of smooth, but it's just like the delivery of it is so stiff you can't even tell if the lines are well written or not, because they just sound bad enough that they just come off bad all around. But as far as Liam Neeson delivering some of these lines, there is an intensity that he has to bring to it that he does effectively, and you might say, "Oh, Liam Neeson doing intensity, how brand new." But there are moments in here where it is like, because things are starting to set in for him, it's like there's times where he's not sure if he's killed somebody or not, and this could be really, really crucial if he has. So you get moments like that that do bring genuine intensity, but for the most part, it's still really, yeah, just kind of stiff. I mean, we do get a couple of scenes here where he gets to play. Like, it's not just, the intensity. There's also stuff where we get, like, he has a scene with his brother who's, like, more or less catatonic in, like, a nursing home. And they have one scene, and it shows, like, this really, like, he tells a story, and it shows this different side to him where we can see, like, another side of the coldness of this character. That works really well because of how Neeson plays it. Like, I could see this on, like, reading this on the page would be like, okay, but we saw this guy, strangle a dude in front of his mother. Who really gives a fuck? But there's something about, like, Liam Neeson smiling and being likable, but not in, like, this sort of sadistic way that you would expect from the character we saw in the opening scene. But it's like there's like a tenderness here that's actually coming through effectively, despite what we've seen this guy do before, and that is a testament to what Neeson can do, kind of showing different sides of a character and being able to play those just right. But and there's a crucial scene where he watches a really disturbing video. Like, it's a not as over the top version of the scene in Hardcore where George C. Scott watches the porn movie. And it's like to have that also to kind of bring a bit of a devastation to the character also. There's a lot going on here with this character. It's really just kind of comes back to the writing as far as stuff that's probably not going to quite work or stuff that feels like it's falling short. As far as this character goes, there is one aspect that only comes up like twice, where I don't know if he's like, it's when he's trying to remember something and he can't or something, but there's like two moments really spread apart. One at like the very, very end and one like way earlier, where when he's trying to think of something, he stutters. And it's like some of the most unconvincing stuttering you'll probably ever see in a movie. To the point that I'm not even sure if that's exactly what it's supposed to be, but it's bizarre. So there's still some bizarre choices in here, but Neeson is so good in the scenes where he's really good. I would probably chalk that up to like bad direction or using a bad take or something like that. So Neeson's game for this stuff, and that's probably why he keeps ending up in roles like this, is that he's willing to try to bring some sort of dignity to this very repetitive shit. So there's that. Another thing, though, that I will give this movie credit for, that I was completely expecting that wasn't here, was there's this really annoying thing in the original movie where whenever he's, like, having flashes of memory, or it's like his memory's really disjointed and he's not sure if what he's remembering actually happened or not, it's that really annoying, flashy editing that, like, straight-to-video directors do that I hate so much. And I remember when I was thinking about that, it was like, oh, God, this is like an American remake. They're going to have a field day with this shit. And I had to, because the back row is more or less taken, which is where I usually sit, I had to sit closer than I normally do. And it was a small auditorium, so I felt like really close to the screen, uncomfortably close to the screen. And I was just thinking, like, man, if there's flashy shit in this, this is going to be miserable. And they avoided it. They didn't go that route. There's one flashy scene really quickly where he's having, like, a dream about killing people, and it's really brief. And the fact that it was actually the original movie that was guilty of that really annoying editing and that really annoying style, and not this, Americanized remake, was very surprising. And I was really grateful that it wasn't shittily made. It wasn't shittily directed or shittily edited. So that's something. Like I know the bar is extremely low when we're saying it. The editing isn't shit. The direction isn't shit. We're doing well. It's once you have to set the bar that low though, because if you have any sort of expectations for this whatsoever, you're probably not going to be that pleased. It's like I was saying before. Also, it's not probably as action heavy as people are expecting. Also, because there is a fair amount of character work, as stiff as it is, and what's driving the plot forward. But at the same time, you could also say it's a little too busy. There's a little too many characters. There's a little too much going on, and it jumps around a little too much. And you might lose track of it along the way at some point. If I wasn't already familiar with the story from the original movie, I probably would have gotten lost at some point. But there were mostly old people in the theater with me, as you probably guessed, and I heard at least 2 or 3 different people snoring at various different times. That could be an old person thing. That could be the movie. That's the risk you take, I guess. But I was never really that. Well, I could say I was never really that bored with it, but that's also because it hits every beat of the original movie almost until the epilogue is different. And once again, another thing to the movie's credit, another change that it made that actually works is without saying too much, the epilogue is a bit more cold-blooded in this one. So about it being being worried about it being a watered-down version is really definitely not the case at all. And like I said, if anything, this one might go a little harder in some cases. So there is that. But I do kind of miss, there's not as much of, I don't know if quirks doesn't feel like the right word, but it's the only one I can think of, to describe, some of the characters in the original, like how the cops interacted and stuff like that. And there's the scene where, there's a scene with a bomb, obviously, in both of these movies. And there's a moment in the original movie where the bomb's timer ending and the bomb going off, there's a delay. That's like darkly comedic, and this one doesn't have that. So it's like those little quirks like that I feel like are kind of missing here, and like there's a bit of a dark sense of humor that's not in this one that could have elevated it a little bit more probably. Like the closest thing I feel like you get to that is just some things that are, I'm not even sure you could call this comedic or intending to be comedic, but like there's a point in time where Neeson has to like Anton Chigurh himself. He has to fix up the wounds that he's gotten in battle, and there's a particular way that he closes a wound that was very unexpected. I guess the visual was unexpected. I guess you could say. So there is that, and another kind of cool decision they made was the head. There's a lot of villains going on in this, and there's a lot of different like levels these villains are on, and of course there's the villain that's at the very top. Which was a dude in the original movie, and not only have they now gender swapped the head villain, but the head villain is now Monica Bellucci, which is very cool casting. She doesn't really get to do anything like what the character's capable of, but you almost kind of, because it's Monica Bellucci, you kind of want to see a bit of, I don't know if I'd want to say scenery chewing, but to see her get to be like that sort of head villain type and kind of bring a bit more life to the role, but she's really just kind of there, while all the other villains do all the other work, and there's one particularly emotional scene, not for like the audience, but for the head villain in the original movie, where we see the villain vulnerable. And I was disappointed that scene's not really here. It's here verbally, but the emotion's not in it. So there's like, for everything it seems like, oh, they kind of took it to the next step, that's great. There's another thing that feels like, oh, I would have kept that in because it gives the movie personality that this one doesn't have. Because that's really the thing here is, yeah, this movie does go hard in certain cases, and it is darker than you'd probably expect out of a Liam Neeson action movie, especially with the subject matter in particular is really dark. Like I'm actually very surprised how much this version didn't water it down. But it still has like no real personality at the end of it. It's like I can understand why I could hear people snoring while I was in there, and not just because they were old, but yeah, so, and, you know, as far as what Neeson's bringing here, me talking about, like, it might sound like, you know, I'm knocking on old people, but I mean, I just looked it up because I couldn't quite remember. In about a month and a week, Liam Neeson's gonna be fucking 70. And he doesn't look like it, and he doesn't act like it. Like, he's supposed to look really, like, you know, old and worn down in this movie. Because the guy in the original movie looks much older than Liam Neeson does now. Um, but you could tell it's like they had to age him like for the movie to make him look older and worn down. So he's still going strong. I don't know how much longer he's going to do that. I feel like every time one of these comes out, he says it's his last one, but I don't know. So it's like we're all just kind of waiting for it. It's like Tom Cruise. We're just kind of waiting for him to go back to prestige projects to see what magic is still there. But it's yeah, not to compare the masterclass in action filmmaking that is the Mission Impossible movies to the shit, but it's yeah. So like I said, this isn't like terrible or anything. Like if anything, it's just a little too lifeless and could have like I said maybe kind of a dark comedic edge because I was talking about that Cold Pursuit is actually pretty good, and one of the things Cold Pursuit really had going for it was that really dark and wicked sense of humor, and that's the kind of thing that would probably come through really well here too. That is present in the original movie, not like a lot, but just enough. And like finding that just enough sort of levity probably would have helped this out a lot. But as it is, it looks pretty bland in general. But I do admire it for how much it didn't water down the material and how it, you know, went a little harder in instances. But still, at the end of the day, it's still a pretty bland and lacking personality. So that's really the main drawback with it. But it's okay. So I don't regret seeing it necessarily, but you wouldn't be really missing anything either if you didn't, if you skipped it. So especially since the original movie exists anyway. So let's go on to the Survivor now, which is the movie that HBO Max put out. I think they put it out on like Wednesday or something. And this is Barry Levinson's new movie, starring Ben Foster as a boxer in the Holocaust. That's pretty much the general way to say it. Like, if you were to try to describe this movie to somebody in, like, 2 seconds, that's probably what you would say. And it is this back and forth where we see him, and he's in a concentration camp, and he has made a deal with one of the Nazis, who's essentially becomes a manager of sorts, and he... To basically save his own life, he participates in boxing matches to the death with other prisoners, which is very, very dark. And it's one of those cases also where this is a true story, and it's like you're watching some of the imagery here in in the concentration camp scenes, because we're split up in time between the like late 40s, I think, where he is out of the prison now and he's back in civilization and he's boxing. He's building up for a fight with Rocky Marciano. And we're cutting back and forth between this and his time in the concentration camp. And when you see this imagery, because you got the black and white, so there's probably going to be a lot of Schindler's List comparisons as far as the appearance of the concentration camp scenes. But I mean, specifically, like, seeing, the boxing ring and a boxing match, and it's one thing that the fights are to the death, and that this is so brutal and relentless, and like the soullessness of the carnage, I feel like was kind of one of the main reasons to do these scenes in black and white, because it just feels so... It takes that, like, just the life is completely drained out of this whole scenario, and you barely see any ounce of humanity, which is obviously totally the point. And that's one thing, but, like, to see the image of this Jewish character that's in a concentration camp, and you see, like, he's down to the bone, obviously, and he's beat to shit because he's done this over and over again. And he's in the corner, and it's this Nazi, played by Billy Magnuson, who's, like, strangely perfectly cast. Like, I would have never thought of him for a role like this, but then as soon as I saw it, it's like, that weirdly makes sense. It's nothing, like, it's as far as appearance goes. because he's got the blonde hair and the look and everything. And to see him in the corner with this prisoner in this concentration camp as like a boxing trainer is so insane. And it's like to think that this is a like if this weren't a true story, you would never ever believe this at all. And it's like it's that insane and that surreal to see this in kind of the worst way, in a very very effective way. And like the black and white photography is really effective also to showcase all this. But it's like it's this insane. It's one of those cases yet again where when you realize this is a true story, you can't believe you've never heard this story before. It's nuts. This story. And then there's all these. There's a lot of side plots going on also, where like he's also. Look, he got separated from. I can't remember if it was actually his wife or not, but it was the love in his life he got separated from. So he's working with Vicky Creeps, who you probably remember from Phantom Thread, and she's the one that's helping him try to locate this woman that he lost while the boxing plot is going on. And it's so interesting how this movie approaches these different storylines, because it's another one of those cases where you would think there's an awful lot going on, but there's such a perfect balance because the movie is, for having a story like this, you would kind of expect almost like while the story is insane in itself, you would also expect it to be a sort of biopic approach, like a generic biopic approach, regardless of the subject matter. But what makes it especially different is that it feels more character-driven than what you initially imagine as like a biopic. And there's a lot of actors coming into this, and surprisingly none of them feel wasted. You've got John Leguizamo is his sort of trainer, and then you have Danny DeVito as one of Rocky Marciano's trainers who actually comes over to help Ben Foster, because it's like, I just want to make sure you don't die in the ring. Because like this isn't about you winning or anything like that. So it's like in that almost Rocky sense where it's like it's not really even about winning. It's just about kind of having that opportunity. But then again, talking about this movie being unexpected and how it approaches these stories is the Rocky Marciano fight happens halfway through the movie. So like that's not even necessarily our stopping point. And then the whole story of him looking for his love actually ends up going in a different direction also. And so it kind of keeps going these directions. And there's another thing here with Peter Sarsgaard playing a reporter who's doing this story about, him, what he was doing in the concentration camps and the fighting and stuff like that. And that takes us down a whole other path where he's seen as a traitor by the Jewish community because he was killing other prisoners to essentially save his own life. And it's at that point there that you can see the complexity of this guy and the complexity of this character, because he's very much aware, because this character could have been played like two different ways at least, but those ways would have been like their own path. Like it wouldn't have been like, two different ways together. It could have been, he could have played him this way or this way. But there's a lot of complexity in this character, so obviously in Foster's performance there's going to be also. And it's like, it's the kind of intense role that we immediately know Ben Foster's capable of, because Ben Foster's one of the most committed actors that we have right now. One of the most unsung for sure. And talking about the commitment itself, because at first you would think, obviously, like the physical commitment, obviously, because when you hear about, actors that train for boxing movies, it's always like really rigorous. They're actually taking hits and stuff like that. But keep in mind also, Foster's playing somebody in one sense is in a concentration camp, and then in another segment is, out in civilization and beefed up. And it's like, so physically he's on two completely different sides, in that sense, on top of just the boxing itself. But there's also that whole thing where he's somewhere between, like, self-justification, like, I did what I had to do, and self-loathing, because he is, without even those moments where, he's called a traitor and they spit in his drinks and stuff like that, and he's outcast, to be outcast in one way, so, heinously, and then to come back and then it's, his own people, because that's just the situation he ended up in. But there's such an awareness of both sides and the way he has to play those. But it's also, he's one of those characters where he has all these different run-ins with all these different characters, whether it be, his trainer or the reporter or all these other people, and then, the Nazis themselves. And you constantly get this sense that he's the kind of character that just sees through everybody. To where it's like anytime he gets into a situation, it's not unknowingly, it's not inadvertently, he's not being tricked into anything. He's perfectly aware of everything around him and what he's doing, and it's seeing how he interacts or reacts to these different characters and the different paths they're gonna be the gateway to. Not necessarily lead him down, but just be his gateway to, another path. Is really fascinating to watch, and just in general, the combination of Ben Foster and Barry Levinson goes very well. I saw Liberty Heights once. Like, that movie's like, oh my god, 99? So that movie's 23 years old now. And I saw it once, maybe 15 years ago, if not longer ago. And I still think about that scene where his angry girlfriend's dad brings him home, and he refuses to leave the car until the song ends. And it's like, that's a scene that I still think about. And it's like that, just that combination of Barry Levinson and Ben Foster in general has me very excited. And it's clear that there's something here between them, that they can really bring characters and memorable stories to life in a really vivid way. So, another thing I kind of want to talk about is his relationship with this Nazi that Billy Madison plays, that gets him into the whole boxing thing and the death match thing. And what's interesting about him is not only does he bring forth this really, crazy imagery of seeing, this concentration camp prisoner in the same boxing corner as this Nazi that's coaching him, essentially, but it's like, while we have that, there's something, it's interesting. I don't want to say they're like similar extremes or anything, but it's interesting how much the scenes with him and the Nazi have in common with the scenes with the reporter, Peter Sarsgaard's character. Because where we have that whole thing where it's, well, we talked about, how the Foster character has this, sense of self-justification about, feeling like he did what he had to do regardless of the consequences and what that means and what, the death that it caused and the pain that it caused, even long after the fact. But this idea of, we have a moment where Billy Madison's character also goes through a dialogue where he justifies himself, and it's like it was very much reminiscent of the opening scene of *Inglourious Basterds*, where Londa's talking about the fact that, like, it's, this is just something to get me from point A to point B. Like, it's not necessarily about, the hatred for a specific race or anything like that. It's just, this is just a convenience for me to be able to do whatever I'm going to do next. And that's a really interesting thing, but it's also to show, like, the exploitation of the Foster character and why he's doing what he's doing, getting him involved in the death matches. And then when you think about the fact that the reporter wants to get this story out, which could have been its own movie, this reporter getting the story, but it's like it happens instantaneously, where Peter Sarsgaard shows up and he's like, hey, I want to write this story about you and how you got to this point. And then in the next scene, the story's out and the consequences are happening. And it's like to see these different kinds of exploitation happening, but it's the same story. Like, it's so interesting to me how closely the Nazi and the reporter play the parts that they play in this story in regards to the exploitation of Foster's character is very interesting. And as it goes on, like, in this sort of middle portion when he's training for the Rocky Marciano fight, which, like I said, there's whether it be him looking for, the old love of his life, or the training, or the reporter, and all that stuff. It's like, these are all things that could have been an entire movie, that the movie is sort of separated into these parts while telling the full story. And there's a whole middle portion here, where he's got, all these trainers around him and all these people around him, and it's kind of here where it's like when you hear, the Holocaust and, like a boxing movie within the Holocaust and stuff like that, it doesn't exactly scream Barry Levinson right away. but in these moments in the middle, these scenes that are so dialogue driven and character driven, it actually does visibly become what we're used to seeing Barry Levinson do, the kind of material we're used to seeing him do. In particular, in this scene in the middle, where we have all these characters sitting around like a picnic table, in like the middle, like from a break from training, and these are all people that have like they come from oppressed backgrounds, and they're just kind of having dialogue about that. But nothing that feels too heavy-handed or like it's being preachy or anything like that. It feels very natural and between like gradual between these characters. Like it's a real conversation that these real characters would have. Like it doesn't feel like movie dialogue. And like and even when it does get into like hard hitting lines, they're delivered so nonchalantly that their power kind of comes after the fact. Like there's a moment when they're eating lunch, and Ben Foster, who is Jewish, starts eating ham, and Danny DeVito stops him and says, "You realize you're eating ham, right?" And Foster stops and he says, "That's okay. God doesn't pay much attention to me anyway." And the way it's delivered is almost like there's like a comedic punch to it, because it's so nonchalant. But then like there's also such weight to that line too, to where it's like you kind of chuckle at it at first, and then you're like, oh, like it punches you a little bit. And that's the kind of genius dialogue that's kind of just like subtly kind of in here that'll just kind of sneak up on you. Like I said, where it doesn't feel like it's trying to be like movie dialogue necessarily, which is really important as far as it being able to get its point across in a really, really effective way. Um, so so this is basically a great movie, a really great movie, and then maybe around the hour and a half mark, and it's about 2 hours. Like I think when the credits start, it's like exactly 2 hours. So there's this last half hour that it started to feel like it was. I started to feel a little distance from it because there's a time jump. Because like we're already going back and forth between the late 40s and back when he was in the concentration camp, but like from the late 40s, there's a time jump, and it's at that point that we get scenes that start to feel a bit more generic biopic, I guess you could say. And it's taken us down a path that wasn't like it. They kind of took the least interest. Like all the story threads are good, but they took the least interesting of the plot threads, and that's what we kind of followed for the last half hour. And it's kind of underwhelming for it being such a great movie for such a while, and it never like goes like really downhill or anything, but it didn't feel like it was quite at the level that it was throughout. Once we get to this last half hour, and I felt less invested in it. I guess would be the quick way to say it. And there are more flashbacks in it to the concentration camp, and those are the scenes that really hit the hardest, obviously. So it's like, but they get fewer and far between. So when we get to this point, it's like you're almost kind of hoping for flashbacks because those are the really interesting and most emotional scenes. As we're kind of it's the way it does circle back around. There is definitely emotional value to this. But I feel like it kind of plods its way there a little bit. So that's kind of unfortunate, but it doesn't like necessarily sink the movie or anything. But I feel like it's something that just kind of keeps the movie from reaching like total and complete greatness. But it's still very, very good, and I would absolutely look into it if this stuff, if any of this seems interesting to you at all. So, I think that's all I really have to say on that. So, yeah, obviously next week is Doctor Strange, and before that, before that, obviously we're doing another Q&A video on Sunday, and then there's the moving violations video on Monday. So, whatever's in between that, I have no idea. Whatever Owen and/or Ashley throw out there. So I think that's what we have to look forward to until Doctor Strange gets here. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.